Welcome to a book club, really, on artificial intelligence with Charlotte Blease, who spent time with us here actually as a Fulbright scholar and is extremely accomplished in the space of informatics, AI, with a background in philosophy, and has written this wonderful book, Dr. Bot, Why Doctors Can Fail Us and How AI Could Save Lives. And Charlotte's going to begin with a brief presentation, and then we'll have a conversation.
I'll talk quickly because there's too many slides. I was too ambitious, but we'll go through it quickly. Can I use just these? Yes. So basically I want to start with a couple of personal stories. This is my late partner, Henry MacDonald. He wasn't the reason I wrote the book, but life happens in between when you're too busy doing things. And Henry was the editor for the Ireland editor for the Guardian newspapers, who's a very accomplished guy. Used to dealing with all kinds of conflict zones and atrocities. But he fell ill in 2018 with stomach cancer, and we were sort of coming up to that very important 5-year mark when he fell ill again. And there was talk it was sort of gallbladder problems, but your mind is running on the dual track, wondering what it is. But in early appointments, I want to say his care was phenomenal. He was cared for by the NHS, but there were some things that were a bit unsavoury that were said a couple of occasions. Early on in one of the appointments, and so bearing in mind, Henry was a guy who interviewed terrorists and prime ministers for a living. But the doctor said to him, Henry, this could be a bad thing or it could be a very bad thing. And Henry had a dark sense of humour, but there was a sense of why is he infantilizing us? Another time, at this point, it was clear he was terminally ill. This was a month before he died. And he insisted on walking up the reception desk it was very clear he was ill. And the receptionist sort of barely looked over her computer to say, your appointment is cancelled. You're no longer a priority patient. So these are the kind of things, despite the great care that you tend to remember. This is a picture of me with my twin sister, Catherine, my mum. That's a minor celebrity in Britain we sort of chanced upon, mildly funny comedian. But my sister has a very rare form of muscular dystrophy that for many years it took, sort of late 20s, she visited the GP a lot with sort of nondescript symptoms, but cramps in her hands and feet. She was told sort of odd things, wear and tear. So she's not a trapeze artist, she's pretty sedentary. It was a bit strange. Iron these cramps out with a rolling pin. Another time she told us probably psychosomatic, that she was actually depressed, which actually made her feel a bit depressed. So sort of a lottery. There was a locum GP who was able to diagnose the cluster of symptoms. He saw immediately the pattern, if you like, and diagnosed. There was subsequent tests. But my eldest brother waited 20 years for a diagnosis in and out of seeing doctors. So there's always morals, these sorts of sob stories, and there's always three. Healthcare is always personal to patients, caregivers. Processes let patients down. Processes I want to talk about. Most people probably have stories like these. And if you don't, you might well do at some point, unfortunately. So the real takeaway I want to say is very often in medicine we're used to the patient or the family member being wheeled out. Ultimately, what I want to say is sort of the theme of the talk is conventional wisdom is a very poor substitute for the fact it doesn't do a lot. People feel a bit gooey, but nothing really happens. So I'm focusing basically on scientific evidence for how we could do things differently. We often hear this mentioned in medical talks. It's sort of trite, but it's the function of medicine is the care of the patient. My background's philosophy, so I have to have a background in philosophy to think philosophically. But the key question I think we can ask then is who or what is best placed to deliver that. So if you know allegiance to the way you've been trained or a particular institution, you can ask that question. Who or what configuration of who or what is best placed to deliver the care of the patient. So I want to motivate a distinction between process thinking and outcomes thinking. Basically, very often I think in debates about technology, the focus is often on defending particular processes to which we may have an allegiance to human judgment, or be trained and so on. Um, we may want to protect processes, but we need to leverage additional argumentation as to why that's a good thing, or protect traditions and so on. So the key thing I want to say is focusing on the outcomes if we really do care about the purpose, the function of medicine and healthcare more broadly. So with that in mind, I'm going to rattle through just sort of 5 conventional wisdoms. The first is, I think, very often when we talk about AI, the debate is about what the technology can do. Patently, that's important, but I think it can't be the whole conversation. Certainly, what I tried to do, half of my book is about saying, very often they're taboo conversations, but what are the human limitations with medicine? So, what are the specific problems to which AI or all kinds of technology actually could potentially be a solution? And I can't go through it all, but basically, I take the approach, say you have the most well-funded healthcare system in the world, you're going to still reach a ceiling effect on what human cognition can achieve within that system. So, of course, there's huge numbers of challenges here. I really can't go through them all. Diagnostic error affecting certain populations, noise in health and medicine. Daniel Kahneman's written a lot, certainly wrote a bit about this too. We can talk about sex of doctors, cognitive decline, junior doctors learning new processes. All of these things create errors. About a third of doctors in Europe are 55 years and older, and there's evidence that could affect. I'm 49, so I feel like cognitive decline's already kicked in. So many of these processes are invisible. But I do sort of belabor the point that there's psychological fissures in healthcare. By default, you as a patient are consulting with somebody who's an expert. But when you look at the psychology of status, subordinates in a contextual relationship tend to behave in particular ways. They tend to be more deferential. Equally, the higher up in this case will behave in certain patterns that arise that can affect information gathering, the flow of conversation, and all the rest of it. So that's how I kind of focused a lot of my discussion in the book. Second issue is AI ethics. Has very much been about talking about the risks of AI, and I think that's part of the conversation, but it's certainly not all of it. It's New York Times, Guardian, all these newspapers focusing very much on AI's harms, and of course everybody in this room recognizes we've got to resist those sort of simplistic binaries. It's certainly not all there is to ethics. It's much more complicated conversation about benefits and risks and what it does to autonomy and truthfulness and privacy, confidentiality, and so on. I just want to give one example, because a lot of the scholarship in AI ethics is to do with algorithmic bias. So Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. And I think in some sense, it's a very important conversation, the extent to which there can be discrimination with algorithms, but in a certain sense, we've got to be more cynical than what that scholarship is saying, and that's to say, compared to what? Because, when I spent time in Harvard Medical School, a lot of the debate about disparities in healthcare would focus on the problems, but then when you consider what are the solutions, very often there's sort of tick box exercise. Let's do anti-bias training. There's no evidence that actually works. Might raise consciousness, but it doesn't work for the patients who are the subject of bias. So the key issue is it actually easier when you take it in the round? Is it easier to de-bias technology? We tend to hold technology to higher standards, so it opens up a more interesting conversation about being constructive in addressing ethical issues. So I guess, there's a whole range of ethical concerns here with technology, environmental costs, a whole variety of issues. But I always come back to the issue of compared to what, and there's also risks of inaction. So you can speak of sins of omission and sins of commission. There's sometimes an assumption that doing nothing is better, but that's just because it's familiar to us. So there are moral consequences of the status quo as well. The third conventional wisdom is, again, I used to hear this a lot, doctors and AI will work together. I This idea of being a team sport, I don't want to pick on one person in particular, but very often this idea, I mean, Eric Topol, many thinkers have sort of, I feel it's sort of disingenuous actually, but I'll say why I think it's problematic. But talking about doctors and AI, sort of that AI is going to augment what doctors do, I think is mistaken empirically. I think it's the origins of this intellectually probably come from examples such as in chess with the idea of so Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov in 1997, but then there was this era of centaurs in chess, so basically pairing amateur chess players with technology, and for a while that was the strongest combination. I think probably the origin comes from some of this within the culture, but and so park that idea, but certainly we know that looking at generative AI tools, not with other traditional clinical decision support tools, doctors are gravitating towards these tools for a variety of reasons, I think why. But Ken suggested, why don't we do a survey on this about a year after ChatGPT was unleashed? And we did one in the UK. To our horror, I think to our surprise, really, some maybe about 5% might be using it, but about 20% of doctors said they were using these tools for any clinical task. Next year it went up to 25%. ChatGPT is always at the forefront of adoption of all of these tools. And this year we did it again. It's more than half of British doctors, use it, doubling in 1 year of doctors using these tools. So we know they're using these tools, but that doesn't mean they're using them effectively, of course. And coming back to this interesting idea of Kasparov's law, the idea that it's a weak human plus a machine plus a good process that is the sort of winning formula. I think what's been less interrogated in healthcare is what is the idea of weak human. So we're not talking about necessarily doctors as experts, as almost the grand masters. What would the expertise look like here? I think it's an open empirical quest that we haven't yet figured out what that should be. There's also a siloed body of research when you look at doctors, domain experts working alongside technology. And to put it very crudely, that research tends to show that lay people defer to algorithms who tend to be more appreciative, but experts tend to be more nose-holding towards algorithmic output. And there's a sort of psychological literature on why that might be the case. It's not clinician or expert arrogance, it's very often overconfidence or the nature of Kahneman's sort of system one thinking. And so experts often lack insights into why it is that they reach certain decisions. So I guess chess analogy is a bad one for another reason. That's to say that at this point, there's no centaur that can beat AI, so that era is completely over. And we're seeing this within certain studies right now. I mean, there's obviously caveats with these sort of experimental studies that look at randomized control trial situations where Ethan Go and Adam Roman and people like that, considering AI on its own, or generative AI tools on its own, versus paired with doctors and so on. And the AI, doctors tend to hurt the accuracy of the AI. And of course, that stands on, I think, a whole body of literature. So I suppose a fifth insight I would say is we have to think about what these new clinical configure. It's sort of touching our pearls and saying doctors' skills are being atrophied. Well, what particular skills do they need, and do we actually call them doctors anymore? What does that's a whole other conversation. The fourth wisdom is to say, conventional wisdom is to say, AI is not about replacing jobs. I think that's disingenuous. You probably know this guy, Clayton Christensen, who's a Harvard Business School analyst who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, who's responsible for this word disruption. But tech bros talking about, moving fast, breaking things, and disruption with technology. Very often, so he basically focused on two different kinds of phases when it comes to technology. Automation, I still think we are too preoccupied with automation when we discuss what AI is going to do in a particular domain. By automation, he means sort of almost a synonymous replacement of current tasks with technology. So emails replacing letter writing and so on. But the disruptive phase is where the technology is completely redefining the task. And the example he gave in a later article was home movie industry. Basically, it was a very short window whenever Netflix had this sort of automating phase where you could pick your movies instead of going to the movie rental store, you pick them online, but it was more or less the same model. And of course, the next stage is the rest is history. It was a completely disrupted model of home movie rental. So the sixth thing I'd say is in disrupted phase, the competition, it just doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like previous processes. And of course, it's a bit trite, but let's come back to this. Seasonal almanacs, people, which are really dependent on human expectations more than the technological trends, but where we tend to overestimate what technology is going to do for us in the short term. So the fifth thing I come back to is these surveys that I've been doing with Ken actually and other surveys among all kinds of clinicians, psychotherapists too. The thing that they say that they'll never, the task I feel like that they perform, that they say they'll never be replaced on is empathy. And which I think is really interesting, partly because I don't think anybody spends 10 years in medical school to be an empathizer. But I think what I want to say about that is, well, a variety of things, but the sort of eighth insight I would say is empathy is a lot harder than it looks. And that's why I began with mentioning what happened with Henry. And because very often doctors, when they're multitasking, when you're multitasking, it's a misnomer psychologically. You're basically task toggling. So the more tasks that you have to perform, the more challenging it is, and the more errors you're going to commit. So the doctor, basically with Henry, probably was resorting back to sort of rehearsed or scripted kind of dialogue. So putting on his empathy demeanor, if you like. So it's no wonder that it's a bit clunky and it doesn't seem appropriate sometimes. But basically, even the idea that we should desire empathy and care has also been challenged. As Paul Bloom, a psychologist, he's not the only one who's looked into this, but sort of philosophical tradition as well, saying when you read, for example, medical memoirs, they're very often populated with the doctor saying about patients for whom they felt a special connection, so who reminded them of their son or their grandmother or something. So people tend to be more empathetic to people who look and sound like them. And of course, there's a limitation on the number of people we can be genuinely empathetic towards. So that all deserves attention if we're saying that doctors, I think doctors are actually the least well equipped of any humans to deliver empathy, given the other burdens on them. But what if you break down empathy? What is it exactly? It's a variety of things. There's something called emotional empathy, where people catch your emotions, cognitive empathy, which is identifying the emotional states of other people, and then you could have both of the above, but you don't behave in a compassionate way. So it's actually that there's a behavioral component too. What's interesting, if you look at the literature, and we did an experimental study on this, patients actually don't want doctors who tear up in front of them. That's as good as no empathy. So they don't like emotional empathy. So in other words, you're starting to open the door to what technology can do. So they want people to understand their emotional state, and also to behave in a compassionate way. So it's probably then little wonder that people do pour their hearts out to machines. You've known this since the 1960s, as soon as people have been put in front of computers. Both of these guys reached different conclusions about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. But Warner Slack noticed people said more in front of computers, they disclosed more, they were more relaxed. And Joseph Weizenbaum just discovered, if you like, or observed the same thing, but was pretty horrified by it. nonetheless, people are pouring their hearts out to machines, OpenAI, people disclosing suicidal ideation. We see surveys in the UK, more than a third of British adults, I think that's double the number from Kaiser Family Foundation, which is a recent survey. Why are they turning to it? Not only ease of access, but to feel more comfortable. And interestingly, buried within that particular headline, which was widely reported, two-thirds of people said that they reported benefits talking to the technology. More or less similar picture in the States. And throwing that in because there are demographic differences here too. If you're uninsured, you're more likely to use these tools, and younger people are much faster adopters, including among clinicians. So I suppose what I want to say, coming back to the empathy thing, is uh, not only are these tools, generative AI tools, more empathetic, they're less likely to say inappropriate things to patients. Now, but of course, I'm not suggesting that we do away with humans and empathy and whatever configuration, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is we shouldn't purely rely on the fact doctors should be delivering all of these things. If we really wanted to reinvent healthcare, um, and make it more outcomes focused and process focused, you could have other kinds of professionals. And I'm basically going to close it here by saying it's a very interdisciplinary group, I assume, Chip. But we do have to challenge our comfort zones. So some of these conversations can almost feel too offensive at times because it seems like we're critiquing doctors overly, who do very hard jobs, but we do. This is shameless marketing. Now that I'm in America, I'd be comfortable with marketing, but there's a shameless plug for the book. That's it. Take your question. I got it in 20 minutes.
Wonderful, Charlotte. So let's get into this. I'm going to note how you begin the book.
Okay.
So if we look at how you begin the book, everything you said is a little bit even soft pedaled.
Yeah.
You begin with the observation that was made in an Institute of Medicine report, the best known one. And I'll just read it. Every few days, a tragedy on the scale of 9/11 strikes, yet hardly anyone notices. On a daily basis, the equivalent of 4 Airbuses, each carrying 170 people, fall out of the sky, killing all the passengers on board. This death toll seems unthinkable. Although these figures don't make the 24-hour news cycle, the inconceivable is happening on American soil, not at the hands of terrorists or the aviation industry, but at the hands of those whom we entrust our health. Medical error is one of the leading causes of death in the United States, responsible for the fatalities of over 250,000 Americans annually. So you begin with that, and then you get into these issues of empathy, humanity, effectiveness. How does that all flow, and why begin with the most scary statistics?
Because I want people to read it. But well, the book is actually structured according to a sort of traditional medical visit, so would seem the most straightforward way to lead the reader in, and it is full of patient stories and doctor stories and so on too. But it's divided into the moment. So I mean, I begin with the stark figures, but in the introduction, but I also say what doctors have to do as well. I mean, I think what doctors have to do is probably the most challenging most challenging profession, in terms of the demands placed on it. And to that end, I think that in some sense we're setting doctors up to fail in many ways. And I think when we have conversations about error in medicine, sometimes there's still an assumption, or even about empathy, there's sometimes an assumption that a little more education is going to change things. But that's just a salve, and it almost colludes in the idea that doctors are demigods, because there's only so far you can go with education and keeping up to date and multi all these things that doctors are supposed to do. I think we're going to look back and say, how the hell did we expect people to do all of these things? But the book is structured in such a way as looking at I do take very seriously the idea of what are the specific problems in healthcare. So from accessing care to discussing your symptoms with a doctor, and the flow of conversation to them keeping up to date effectively, making an accurate diagnosis. I have a chapter called the dark art of medicine. We talk about machines being black boxes, but of course medicine's full of black boxes as well. And then empathy, which people tend to think is a soft skill, and it's pretty straightforward. It's, I think, very, very challenging to get right. So that's sort of the structure. But at every point, I'm saying, well, what can current technology do? What does it need to do in order to address each of these issues?
And you talk about some of these sort of assumptions, like early on when ChatGPT first came, 3.5 was released and sort of took the world by storm. The party line was, well, doctors will deliver the empathy. That was absolutely the party line in late 2022 into 2023. And then a study was done actually by a former CHIP postdoc that got a huge amount of attention,
Yeah,
where by looking at various Reddit posts and
yeah,
answering them by machine or by actual physician, the machine was rated more highly on empathy.
yeah,
And so that kind of blew that assumption out of the water. And you get at the idea that this empathy is much more complex. And also, when we talk about empathic doctors, we also, I think, it pays in all these conversations to remember that there's about 1 million doctors. And so when you generalize as to what a doctor can and can't do, you're really talking about 1 million individual human beings from all kinds of different backgrounds and trainings, and who have been trained up in a medical system that doesn't necessarily even focus on those issues as they're being trained. So how do you think this sort of like these assumptions that you're talking about, where you're clearly indicating that some of these are not
yeah.
grounded and will not hold up, where do you think we are like today? What are the assumptions today that will hold up and that will not hold up? The sort of the memes that are most prevalent right now.
I think the empathy one's still out there, so it's the thing I most get asked about, and there's most pushback on, but it recedes in different ways. So it might be, well, uh, we know chatbots appear empathetic, but patients still might not like that because it's not real empathy; it's some sort of ersatz empathy. Um, but then, when you come back to it, doctor's empathy is probably a bit performative many times as well. So I think I would struggle to sort of give a broad perspective on what I think we're in an experimental age right now with AI. I think nobody's quite sure. It's sort of a period of flux. Nobody's quite sure what's going to happen, how things are going to change. But what I have noticed from the surveys that we've been doing is there's a shift into the recognition. It's not just coming for documentation and the aspects of the job we don't like, it's coming for core clinical tasks. And I think because doctors are using these tools, they're seeing how, like the rest of us, I mean, the Swedish Prime Minister stupidly announced that he was using it to discuss policy last summer. So at every status of society, everybody's using these tools. So I think that it's hard not to be impressed by them, and therefore I think that we're caught between this automation phase where we see aspects of the job can be automated. There's documentation with ambient scribes, but other aspects where we're not clear. There's shifting sands, and I think it's almost like a sort of 17th century emergence of scientific revolution. It's an interesting era to be alive to see but it's also a little bit unnerving, particularly in the whole white collar professionals, how things are going to change. But yeah,
I think doctors have a hard time knowing everything about you that they need to know at any given moment because the system doesn't feed that to them in a consumable format,
Right.
right? So um, they're busy. The electronic medical records are fairly opaque when you pull them up to understand what's going on with this patient. Patient may be able to articulately tell you. I got to meet your wonderful partner, Henry, and I also remember during the throes of this illness, you were trying to get his medical records together
Yeah.
just to be able to explain to someone what the status was to get more input.
Yep.
How much of what these systems can do do you think is going to be related to just having all the information at hand and being able to have a complete picture versus really the sort of the thinking and the diagnostics? Where do you think we are currently?
I'm not sure I grasped the question. So
So the information gathering
Yeah.
and just the ability to know the patient
Right.
is one thing.
Right.
Like the doctor could do it. Like any doctor could do it, but they don't have the time and they don't have the systems to get it together. So do you think that just knowing the patient is an important step that these is going to advantage these tools?
Because they just are privy to so much information
They're
about it.
privy, they can remember things.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I suppose I would come back to the idea. I think there's a naive psychological portrait of what doctors do. I think there's good reasons why for that, and that is to say, all human beings resort to philosophers and call it folk psychology that resort to a particular rudimentary but crude understanding of how they operate in the world. And I think medicine is no different. But that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the challenges lie. So if we, it could be because I suppose one way to look at it is to say you don't want to replicate everything a human doctor does at scale, or you want to do things differently because humans are quite limited in how they think. So the idea that you would replicate the same processes somehow might not be the right solution. So, for example, OpenAI said, if we can replicate what some aspects of what doctors can do, then we can recreate, the human experience is a bit more at scale, as I said somewhere in the introduction. But that might be a bad thing. Why might that be a bad thing? Because take, for example, divulging information to clinicians, particularly socially sensitive information. And that, people are dying of embarrassment for a variety of reasons. That's the top reason people delay, if they've got health insurance, to delay talking to a doctor. Embarrassment, self-stigmatization. But if you replicate some of the behaviors, even via chatbots, and there's some experimental studies on this. If the chatbots are too fluent or too doctor-like in some way, you're going to recreate some of those inhibiting um, uh, suite of behaviors, which you don't want to do. So there's a design issue here where you want to create some of the things that make it easy to interact with a bot, but not others that might be replicating some of the problems that arise in human-mediated care, doctor-mediated
Doctors
care.
can be very blamey about things.
Blamey about things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So that I mean, this
Yeah,
some of the embarrassment comes
that's
from
true.
actually being
Yeah.
embarrassed.
Yeah. And
actively.
some of it is not, it's not on the doctor either. It's just people being, because you're going to speak with somebody who's, as I say, contextually at higher status. You want to impress. So there's a lot of survey research. Actually, there's not a lot, but there's survey research to show patients they want to be liked by, it's a bit lickspittle, but they want to be liked by their doctor. They want to please their doctor. Um, Irving Goffman, the sociologist, wrote about this. He called it impression management. So in certain contexts, it's like the boss is coming to dinner. You want to be, if you go to speak to a doctor, you want them to like you and want them to think that you're, or she, that you're intelligent, which means people also don't ask the questions that they think that may sound stupid as well. So there's aspects of that relationship that I think get hidden from view by the doctor, who, for well-intended reasons, because they're doing their absolute best. But despite all of that, there can still be obstacles to delivering genuinely accessible care.
So patients with diabetes who haven't been monitoring their glucose on paper will fill in
Yeah,
all the just all that morning. They'll just fill in as if they had been monitoring it all
right,
along on a chart
right.
in order to impress the doctor. So what would an AI do to really be on the patient's side so they wouldn't feel the need to fake the data?
Because it's your own personal
your
clinical
assistant.
confidence. It's going to be in your image, what you want, and it'll be created in your image and what's appropriate for you, and can give you nudges in that kind of confession box, more um, uh, leveraging the anonymity, which is important to people, or that's what I think will make a difference here. And as you say, people do lie to their doctors too. That they do deceive, and there's some survey research on that too. So 85% of Americans have outright lied to their doctor, but it's to do with alcohol consumption and uh, all kinds of issues that, again, people don't want to be judged on.
Right.
Yeah.
So being non-judgmental and being on the side of the patient, knowing all the information. So there's a lot less doctors are available for primary care. I don't know if you know that in Boston, you essentially can't get a primary care doctor. Harvard medical students cannot get a primary care doctor. So physicians at Mass General Brigham cannot get a primary care doctor.
Yeah.
So we're coming to a point now where it's not really replacing doctors potentially.
Yeah.
That's the opportunity, right? We're coming to a point where the opportunity is to fill in a massive gap.
Right.
And so that gets at some of what you were talking about before, where there's this assumption you quoted, John.
Yeah.
It would never be a doctor. It would never be AI without the doctor, but there is no doctor.
Right.
So it will be AI without the doctor.
It already is.
It already is. And so how do you see that playing out? There are already virtual first avatar based services that are sort of getting primary care problems addressed online.
I think we're seeing a mass experiment at scale. It's just a sort of societal experiment too, probably for which litigation will curb the excesses. But I think in some sense, a couple of things, but politically, I think the American Medical Association, a bit like the British Medical Association, I mean, these are all august institutions. They have, in some sense, ring-fenced their expertise as well. So, for example, with physician assistants, particularly in the UK, nurse practitioners taking on some of this work as well, for which there's pretty good evidence that they could be doing some of these tasks. There has been institutional resistance. I think that's part of the problem, which speaks to the issue that, I mean, we know with big tech that they have conflicts of interest, that they're doing nefarious things with data or want to, but the other side of the coin is it would be wrong to say that doctors, don't have skin in the game, but they don't have a conflict of interest, because there is status, there's high remuneration, there's a certain amount of conflict of interest there too, and you've got protectionism. So there is a guild-like mentality around many white-collar professions, which I think deserves to be uh, exposed to some extent, or at least discussed. So very often in these sorts of discussions, a doctor will say, Richard Susskind, who's written a lot about the future of the professions, will say, you speak to a lawyer and they say, I'm happy for AI to come for medicine or accounting, but it's never going to take over law. It couldn't do what I do. Um, and you see a sort of replication of some of that across the profession. So some of it is to do with professional or self-interested reasons, I think, and guardedness. But that can be dressed up as patient worrying about what happens to patients. But on the other hand, patients are also not getting access. It's this case, and Isaac Kahani's written about this too. Compared to what so now, if you don't have access to care of any sort or any kind of expertise, this is something that in some ways may be better than nothing. So, and again, coming back to the issue of AI teaming up with some of these second level, if you like, clinicians or some new kinds of clinical experts. I think there's opportunities there that need to be explored as well.
Interesting. In law is much easier for language models because law is just language, and all the language is available to feed into the model. So the law models are doing really well in law, and medicine is a bit different because we actually don't know what to do with most of our patients.
Okay.
And so the model's not going to just get that from language, whereas case law, it can understand case law, it can go review the case law, it can review the law, it can create briefs and opinions and research. So in medicine, where do you think are the gaps that these models, the current generation of models, will not fill for us?
I still think a lot is dependent on publication bias as well. So I mean, they're still leveraging what's out there in terms of published research. So I think we're still seeing some of the perpetuation of some of those omissions and biases. Um, that's a challenge. And I think the equity issues is a big one as well. Longer term access to, I mean, so I think health and equity, I mean, people are going to have greater access to information. That's a good thing. But then what happens next? And I also believe that I think the disparities are going to persist because it's access to different grades of uh, AI expertise, and that's I doubt that that's going to change. Um, yeah.
So I will open it up to questions just a moment. So think of some questions. So the if there was an AI gap, if there was a gap that AI could fill in some of your experiences with Henry, what would you like to have had there?
Actually, I would say that something much more rudimentary was needed, and that was access to records. I think that would have been very helpful throughout his entire illness because we were quite in the dark at various points. And I mean, bearing in mind he was a journalist, he could do shorthand, and I used to say because very often he would be in these scenarios in hospital beds. He's tired and hooked up to stuff, and he wasn't able to it frustrated me actually because why can't you just ask these questions? I forgot and I don't, when you're actually in the moment, that's very challenging. So I think rapid access to information would have been very useful. On the other hand, there's no point in having access to information if you don't understand it effectively. So I used to ask a friend who's a doctor, who's an obstetrician. It wasn't the ideal specialty, but she was my bit of social capital who I could pull on. She would sort of help interpret things. But I mean, to have had access to ChatGPT or another kind of Claude, maybe is one of my favorite right now, but different kinds of large language model would have been fantastic to be able to have digestible, plain language understanding. And actually, I will say, delivered in a quite compassionate, empathetic way, which these tools we can ask them to do, and they do anyway, would have been really helpful because in this sort of state that you are awake all night, you're wondering what's what, and you're trying to use whatever's available to you. And that's not to say you always want information, you don't always, but when you do want it, these kinds of tools, I think, combined with your record access, so certainly in Henry's case, I think could have allowed for a lot more preparation as well, which could have made a bit of difference to in a very bad situation.
In addition to what the doctors recommended, would you have wanted additional recommendations on treatment options, or were the doctors enough?
The doctors, well, but they still spoke in euphemisms here and there, so you still had to push for information. And they were busy as well. And, you know, some of them were doing that rehearsed bit, I'm putting on my empathy voice now, which is, I sort of everybody understands that, but it can be socially awkward too. So I think access to information is something that should not be underestimated, and the use of these sorts of neurogenerative tools to translate the information, even if it's not making a difference to what your doctor says, you're strengthening the autonomy of giving back some control in a situation where you don't have a lot of control, and that improves your sense of well-being.
So let me open it up to see if there's any questions. Yes.
We have a couple of questions actually. So I feel like most of the presentation or like the talk were more on the pro AI side, and you criticized the field of ethical AI in general compared to what, and I know like humans are biased or modern medicine is not perfect, but doesn't the technology make it worse and come with new challenges or new biases? And if you integrate that directly into like healthcare, for example, isn't that something worth looking into? So I think that's important, or like the first question. So
should we take it
one much related?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I'm entirely, in a certain sense, I have no dog in the fight here. I'm not a medical professional. I have no allegiance to the profession. I'm not allied to big tech. I've never been, pay. I don't have shares in any Silicon Valley company or anything like that. My perspective purely to take the standpoint of the patient's perspective on this, and actually my training is philosophy, so I like the idea of putting on the table interesting propositions and taking a sort of a big picture perspective on things. So I'm trying to interrogate the arguments as objectively as possible. I don't mean to say that I think AI ethics has taken a wrong turn. I just think that it's not exhausted by looking at the harms of technology. And I think algorithmic bias is a big part of it. But what I think where I feel there's been myopia, and that's not to say, I don't want to diminish that as a field of research or what we do about it. I think it deserves to be taken very seriously. My issue is almost we've got to be more cynical, because it's easy, for us to say these biases persist with technology. But what happens if you don't have access to healthcare, or when you do get access, you're subject to biases within it, because human beings struggle to manage their own biases. And the point I was trying to make, the example there, giving one example with algorithmic bias and human biases, for the volume of literature devoted to face-to-face biases in healthcare, it's actually quite shocking that we don't consider what are the solutions to this, because there aren't any meaningful solutions from a patient perspective. There's no current evidence. absence of evidence doesn't mean there couldn't potentially be yet, but there's no evidence that people can manage biases effectively. And people are very bad at spotting their own, they're very good at pointing out bias or discrimination in other people, but not in their own behavior. Doctors work alone for the most part in a sort of primary care context. So managing your own bias is it's not possible. So I suppose what I wanted to say is you've got to take seriously those sorts of problems. Otherwise, you're being disingenuous, and something the situation is worse. Now, there's opportunities with AI, but that also means that we've got to be constructive about how we think about what we feed these tools. And that's not my barrio, but how do we audit them? What do we do next? So it's about being constructive with the technology and looking at the opportunities as opposed to being self-serving and ultimately being um, failing to solve the problem because we don't want to we don't want a rude awakening about our human limitations. I think that's a problem. So I think AI ethics, yeah, like there's a whole range of issues. I'm not trying to say promote AI. There's a wider societal conversation. Who do we want to run our healthcare systems? Do we want it to be Google? Do we want it to be open AI? Because there is a shadow health system, I think, in operation right now. I think the EU, for example, is remiss in thinking that they want to legislate for yesterday's world. People are using these tools, giving their information away. So there's societal, there are political conversations. What happens to the environment? What happens to jobs? Those are wider conversations. My specific focus has been if you want to consider what human doctors are expected to do, so take that particular sliver of conversation. And other people can write other books about the other aspects of it, but technology does have opportunities there. And I don't think they're by any means beyond criticism, but there's opportunities there for solving problems in medicine, but they need to be considered against other kinds of ethical issues too.
Elizabeth.
I have a question. Thank you for the great talk. I'm curious to hear your perspective on how you think like we as a society and as patients should tolerate mistakes made by AI, whether that's like, an AI causing harm or missing something when interacting with a patient. And I think when we compare, AI to doctors often make mistakes, but I think we tend to have a higher bar for automated systems. I often think of the analogy to like self-driving cars. Like humans die every day from car accidents, but when a self-driving car like hits a cat, it's like all over the news and like people are like very concerned all of a sudden about this technology because mistakes aren't really viewed the same. And I'm curious, how you sort of think about how we will navigate that.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's almost a kind of in-group, out-group bias against technology where we do have this higher state standing, as you said, or higher bar for technology. And I mean, I could come back to the issue of when doctors make mistakes too. I mean, in general, patients are pretty forgiving. I know there's high litigation rates and all the rest in the States, but for the most part, patients, tend not to sue their doctor. They recognize to err is human. So I think it'll be interesting to see how technology will be used. I think it's going to get worse for doctors. So I think currently, well, I think it's going to get worse for doctors because lawyers will use AI to look at what ought to have happened. Given the medical record, what should the doctor have done that they didn't do? And that will, probably increase litigation. I don't know if there's any evidence for that right now. But when it comes to AI making mistakes, I think the more people use these tools, there's something called the mere exposure effect. The more familiar you are with anything, the more you like it. It's a bit like if you see a doctor, you may be forgiving of an individual who's behaved in ways that were made an error. So I think it's I don't know the answer is basically the question, but I think we're going to see people continuing to be more forgiving of humans than they are of AI. But I think that that will diminish a little bit. The gap will drop a little bit. But I also think it's important to ask when we ask the question about accountability or human error, most people don't, to say, sue their doctor. Most people are afraid to raise issues with doctors. They don't want to question their doctor, and they don't want to be seen to question the quality of their care, because your life is in their hands. So there's also barriers there, and you see that people don't report sometimes because they worry that that there's going to be consequences. So that's problematic as well.
Okay, oh, sorry. Just a quick follow-up. I wonder if for a long time, like if AI make a mistake, who should eventually be responsible? Like the AI or clinicians or the patients? Because I know like several study states that if clinicians is eventually responsible for AI's mistake, they are not that willing to use AI tools.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not an area I'm have worked on, but I mean, right now, of course, the buck stops with the doctor. But it's an issue. Like, is it the I mean, is it the AI company? Is it the setting in which you use it, and where the AI has been bought in? Who's ultimately responsible and accountable? Um, Huge issue, and I don't have answers to that. No.
Big companies are very good at pushing the liability onto the healthcare delivery system. That's the way electronic medical records work. I think you're right, Felix.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this amazing talk and wonderful, like walking us through so many questions. So I have like two questions. The first one would be related to like maybe like taking the opposite perspective of like democratizing the access to information. So we've been talking a lot about like democratizing the access to information from the patient perspective. But on the other hand, we have a lot of patients in the system that might not be that well to articulate themselves. For example, English that might not be their first language, or they might have like different education levels, and they might just not be like a good primary source of information about their treatment history. So I'm wondering whether that might be another opportunity to actually feed back to essentially to the doctor, actually from a patient perspective, if they might, for example, enter in their own primary language, like describe what happened to them, and then essentially for the AI to like talk to the doctor on the patient's behalf. And the second question was a little bit going to the direction that Ken mentioned, that a lot of the things change like so rapidly. The question that we asked, for example, about empathy, like 2 years ago was a completely different conversation. So I was wondering if we had the same conversation, say in 5 years from now, like what would be the main question that we might be talking about in the future, say 5, 10 years from now?
Good questions. Remind me of the first one.
First one was essentially like feeding back from the patient.
Yeah, I think
an AI.
I think that's probably already happening, where people are using these tools to communicate and to prepare for visits, and in real time, even potentially using your device to communicate. So at the back end, I think patients are doing that anyway. And of course, there's this issue with equity, where it's the people who are most in need may be less likely to have internet-enabled devices, or even though they would benefit the most, or there may be lower digital literacy. But so the persistence of those kinds of issues. But yeah, I think that there's opportunities there too. And the second issue is in 5 years. I think some of it's going to be the issue about who is accountable when things go wrong. That's not going to go away, and probably the issue of how well we are. What is the sweet spot, if at all there is any, for humans working with AI? So it's going to be. I don't think this discussion about who's going to make who is responsible for clinical judgment is going to go away. That's going to be a big issue, particularly when people realize, and I think you hear it anecdotally, but that AI can be very helpful for making diagnoses on the basis of you dump your electronic part of your electronic health record plus your current symptoms, it can still be pretty impressive. So that kind of conversation about who's going to do the work and who's effective, who or what is more accurate, I think will be a continuing bone of contention.
All right, we'll hold it right there. That's
Yeah.
a nice look into the future. And thank you, Charlotte, for a wonderful
Okay.
talk. And Dr. Bott, it's a great read. I recommend it very highly. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.